The mail-order bride who poisoned every husband, 1889, Montana. Her letters were sweet, but her pies were sweeter still. In 1889, Ruth Harper wasn't just any mail-order bride. She was the woman who poisoned every husband she ever had. Her letters were sweet, her promises of love irresistible, but her pies were sweeter still. Men from across the country wrote to her, eager to marry the woman who seemed to offer everything. But what they didn't know was that the moment they stepped into her home, they were walking straight into a trap. Love for Ruth was never about affection. It was about control. And with every husband she lost, her hunger for power grew. But what drove her to destroy the very men she promised to love? Let's uncover how far the line between love and hatred can stretch and where it ultimately breaks. Ruth Harper wasn't always the cold, calculating woman who would go down in history for poisoning every husband she ever had. She started out like anyone else, hoping for love. But Ruth's search for love wasn't just about finding a partner. It was about finding power, control, something she could hold on to when the world had constantly let her down. In 1889, in the small town of Helena, Montana, Ruth decided to take matters into her own hands. The mail-order bride system had been gaining popularity, and Ruth saw it as her chance to escape the suffocating life she had always known. It was a dangerous game, but for a woman with no real prospects, it was the only chance for freedom. She spent weeks crafting the perfect letters, filled with sweetness and promises of everlasting love. Her words were seductive, designed to lure men in, to make them believe that she was the answer to their lonely hearts. The letters painted a picture of a kind, loving woman who longed for nothing more than to make her husband happy. But Ruth wasn't just writing to anyone. She was writing to men desperate for love, men who wouldn't ask too many questions, who wouldn't notice the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. Her first response came from Franklin Monroe, a widower in his late 30s from Chicago. He was exactly the type of man Ruth had hoped for, lonely, eager, and ready to believe in her every word. The letters were exchanged for months, each one filled with more promises, more dreams of the future they would build together. Franklin wrote to her of his dreams of a warm home, children running through the halls, and a love that would last until the end of their days. Ruth played her part perfectly, writing back with words that made him believe she was the woman who could bring that future to life. When Franklin arrived in Montana, Ruth greeted him with a warmth that melted any remaining doubts he had. She was beautiful, with soft brown eyes and a smile that promised the world. He was smitten from the moment he saw her. She was everything he had imagined and more. They were married within weeks. Ruth promised Franklin the kind of love he had always dreamed of. She cooked for him, baked him pies, and greeted him every night with a kiss. For Franklin, it was everything he had ever wanted. But Ruth wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about being loved. It was about control, something Ruth had never had. She had learned early in life that love was the perfect tool to manipulate others to bend them to your will. It started slowly, with small gestures, making sure Franklin's meals were always prepared just the way he liked, keeping his house spotless, making him feel like the king of the home. But soon, Ruth began to notice something. The more she gave, the more he demanded. And with every demand, Ruth's need for control grew. The affection she showed Franklin began to feel more like a trap one she had set herself. Then came the pies. At first, they were just a part of the routine. Ruth would bake Franklin's favorite pies in the evenings and they would share them after dinner. But Ruth began to experiment. She realized that the pies were the perfect vehicle for something darker. The first time she slipped poison into the pie, Ruth was filled with an unexpected thrill. Franklin ate it without hesitation, as he always did. He loved Ruth's cooking, and he loved the way she made him feel like a man of importance. But what Ruth didn't anticipate was how quickly it would affect him. Within hours, Franklin started to feel ill, dizzy, nauseous, and weak. At first, he tried to brush it off, but the symptoms grew worse. He lay in bed, unable to move, his mind clouded by confusion. And Ruth? She watched. She watched as Franklin's body slowly deteriorated as he writhed in pain. Her heart didn't race with fear, it raced with excitement. This was the power she had been craving. Franklin's life was in her hands, and he had no idea. By the time Franklin could barely speak, he began to question what was happening. "What's wrong with me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ruth smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "It's just a little sickness, my love," she said, her voice calm, reassuring. "It'll pass." But deep down, Ruth knew the truth. It wasn't going to pass. The next morning, Franklin died, his body lifeless in the bed Ruth had so carefully prepared for them. He had fallen victim to the one thing Ruth had learned to wield like a weapon, her love. And Ruth? She felt nothing but satisfaction. She had done it. She had taken control. But this was only the beginning. Ruth's need for control, her desire to be the one who held the power, was insatiable. She knew she couldn't stop here. She had tasted the power that came with being the one who decided life and death, and now she was hungry for more. It wasn't enough to love. Ruth had to possess. And the next man who came into her life would never know what hit him. But Ruth wasn't done yet. The next man would be even easier to control, or so she thought. This time, the stakes would be higher and the consequences more deadly. After Frankly's death, Ruth was alone once again. But this time, it wasn't loneliness she feared, it was the loss of power. She had tasted the sweet thrill of control, and now nothing else would satisfy her. The thought of simply being loved without the ability to manipulate was unbearable. She wasn't just going to find another man, she was going to own him. Months passed before Ruth began writing her next batch of letters. This time she was more careful, more calculating. She crafted each word with a sense of cold precision, making sure that every line was designed to draw the man in, to make him believe she was his one true soulmate. She was no longer simply looking for affection, she was looking for obedience. Then Samuel Harris responded. He was a man with a history of failed marriages, a man who had lost everything and was now seeking someone to finally bring him peace. Samuel was no different from Frankly in that respect, lonely, desperate, and eager for love. Ruth's letters to Samuel were flawless, filled with promises of unconditional love, loyalty, and companionship. But underneath it all, Ruth had only one goal: to control him. She had learned from Frankly's death this time she wouldn't make the same mistake. She would be more subtle, more manipulative, and far more calculating. Samuel arrived in Montana a few weeks later, eager to meet the woman who had captured his heart. He was charmed by Ruth's beauty, her gentle smile, and the way she seemed to understand him better than anyone else ever had. Ruth welcomed him with open arms, just as she had Frankly. But this time, something was different. From the very first night, Ruth's love didn't feel like warmth or affection. It felt like a shadow, hanging over Samuel's every move. She praised him endlessly, but always in a way that made him feel like he had to be perfect for her. Everything he did seemed to fall short, as if he could never be enough. It was subtle at first, just little things, the way she asked him to do things again and again, the way she seemed disappointed when he didn't anticipate her every need. Samuel noticed the change. He wasn't the fool Frankly had been. At first he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to Ruth's past heartbreaks and insecurities. But as the days passed, Samuel began to realize the truth. Ruth wasn't loving him, she was using him. Every compliment, every gesture of affection was part of a game Ruth was playing. He didn't know the rules, but he knew that losing wasn't an option. As the days went on, Ruth's behavior grew more erratic. She became fixated on Samuel's every move, his every word. Her affection, which had seemed genuine at first, now felt stifling, as if she was keeping him on a leash. When he disagreed with her, even in the slightest, Ruth would shut him out, silent, cold, and distant, like a switch had been flipped. It was clear now, love was only a tool for Ruth, something to manipulate, something to control. Then came the pies. Ruth began baking them for Samuel, just as she had done for Frankly. The pies had always been a symbol of comfort, warmth, and home, but with Samuel, they became something far more sinister. One night, after a particularly intense argument, Ruth served him a pie that was more decadent than usual. Samuel, hungry after a long day of work, took the first bite. He didn't feel it immediately. At first it just tasted like a normal pie, rich and sweet, but soon his stomach twisted in knots and his head began to swim. The nausea hit him like a wave, overwhelming his senses. He stood up, feeling lightheaded, but Ruth's eyes, those calculating cold eyes, followed him from across the room. She knew exactly what she had done. Samuel collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. His vision blurred, and the pain in his chest became unbearable. Ruth walked over to him slowly, her expression unchanged. She'd done it again. Samuel's life was slipping away just like Frankly's, and this time, Ruth didn't feel a shred of remorse. There was only satisfaction, the cold satisfaction of someone who had played the game and won. But as Samuel lay dying, something unexpected happened. He fought back. With the last ounce of strength he could muster, Samuel grabbed Ruth's arm, his eyes wide with confusion and terror. "Why?" he gasped, barely able to speak. Ruth stared down at him, her face a mask of cold indifference. "Because," she said, her voice soft but steady, "you were never really mine, but now you will be." In that moment, Ruth felt something shift inside her. Samuel wasn't like Frankly. He didn't just accept her love blindly. He had fought against it, and for the first time, Ruth felt a flicker of doubt. but just as quickly, she pushed it aside. Samuel was weak. He had failed the test, and now he would pay the price. Samuel's grip weakened, and with one final breath, he died. Ruth stood over him, her heart still, her mind clear, but the tiny flicker of doubt remained, buried beneath the surface. What if someone could resist her? What if someone could break free? The thought gnawed at her, but she pushed it away. She had control. That was all that mattered. As the days passed, Ruth resumed her life as if nothing had changed. She went through the motions, kept the house clean, cooked meals and baked pies. But something had shifted inside her. There was a lingering unease, a question that refused to go away. What if love could be more than control? What if, somewhere deep inside her, there was a piece of her that longed for something real? But for now, Ruth didn't care. Love would never be about affection for her. It would always be about power, and she would stop at nothing to have it. Ruth had just lost another husband, but the game wasn't over. Someone new would come into her life soon, someone who would test her in ways she never expected. Ruth's reputation in town was growing, though no one fully understood the darkness that lay beneath her charming exterior. She was the perfect wife, the perfect woman to those who didn't look too closely. Her new home was spotless, her meals were flawless, and her demeanor was always warm. But Ruth wasn't interested in simply keeping house. She was interested in control over everything and everyone around her. After Samuel's death, Ruth once again sought out another husband, this time a man named William Greenfield, a well-to-do businessman from out east. William had written Ruth a letter some months prior, praising her beauty and the kindness that shone through her words. But Ruth didn't care about his praises. She cared about what he could give her, a life full of admiration, a life where she could reign supreme. Ruth had learned her lesson well. She would manipulate, control, and ultimately break him, just like the others. When William arrived in Montana, Ruth greeted him with the same practiced warmth. He was a man of refinement, confident in his success, and he seemed genuinely interested in Ruth's life and the future they might build together. Ruth's first impression of him was that he was more than she expected. He wasn't as easily swayed as Franklin or Samuel, but that didn't deter her. She would break him too. For the first few days, Ruth played the role of the doting wife. She made William feel like he was the center of her world, taking every opportunity to remind him how much she loved him. But it was always about control. She showered him with affection when he complied with her needs, and went cold and distant whenever he didn't. Ruth was the queen of this game. And William, like all the others, was nothing more than a pawn. However, Ruth had underestimated William. He wasn't naive. He had seen the cracks in her persona, the moments when her warmth felt forced, when her affection seemed to come with strings attached. He had started to watch her, observe her behavior carefully. William wasn't about to fall into the same trap. One evening after dinner, William asked Ruth about her past, about the men she had been with before him. Her face tightened. She had never been asked about it before. The men who came to her didn't care about her history. They only cared about the love she promised. But William, sharp and perceptive, wanted answers. Ruth gave him a half-hearted story, leaving out key details. But William wasn't satisfied. The next day he did what Ruth had never expected. He went into town. He started asking questions. Ruth's instincts screamed at her to stop him, to keep him from learning the truth about Samuel's sudden death, about Franklin's mysterious illness. She didn't want him to find out that her love was a trap, that she had manipulated every man who had ever entered her life. But there was nothing she could do. William was determined to uncover the truth. By the time he returned, Ruth could tell that something had changed. He wasn't as compliant anymore. His eyes were colder, his demeanor more guarded. He knew something, and Ruth could feel it hanging between them like an unspoken accusation. That night, Ruth baked another pie. The same way she always did. The pie was her weapon, the sweet, deadly gift she would give him. This time, she felt no hesitation as she slipped the poison into the mixture. William had asked too many questions. He needed to be silenced. But what Ruth didn't anticipate was the storm of emotions that would swirl inside her as she placed the pie in front of him. She had been so sure of herself before, so confident in her control. But now, she felt a knot in her stomach, a sense of dread she couldn't shake. Was this the same sense of unease she had felt when she had poisoned Samuel? No, this time was different. This time, Ruth felt like she was losing her grip on everything. William took the first bite without suspicion. Ruth watched him carefully, her heart racing in her chest. For the first time, she wasn't certain of the outcome. Would he fall like the others, or would he be the one to break free? Minutes passed, then an hour. William didn't seem to be affected at all. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. What had happened? Was the poison too weak? Had she made a mistake? But then, William stood up abruptly, his face pale. "I don't feel well," he said quietly, his voice shaky. Ruth's pulse quickened. It was working, but just as quickly, the fear returned. William wasn't supposed to just feel unwell. He was supposed to die. Before she could move, William staggered to the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. His hands clutched at his throat, his body jerking in spasms. Ruth rushed to him, but instead of the power she had expected to feel, she felt panic. She had pushed too far this time. She'd gone too deep. William's eyes locked onto hers as his body trembled with pain. He managed to speak through gritted teeth. Why? The question echoed in the silence of the room, and for the first time, Ruth was faced with the full weight of her actions. This wasn't about control anymore. This was about life and death. She kneeled beside him, her mind racing for the right words. But there were none. Her love had never been real. It had always been a mask for something much darker. William's struggles grew weaker, his breath ragged. Ruth knew this was the end. This wasn't about her winning anymore. He was going to die, and she would be left alone once again. With his final breath, William managed to whisper, "You never knew love." And then, his body went still. Ruth sat back on her heels, staring at him in silence. The power she had craved so badly, the control she thought she had over every man she encountered, was slipping away. She had lost something this time, something important. Ruth didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel like a queen. All she felt was an overwhelming emptiness, like she had given everything of herself and was left with nothing except a growing sense of dread. But Ruth wasn't finished yet. The game had taken an unexpected turn, and the next man to enter her life would be someone she couldn't control as easily as the others. After William's death, Ruth felt the weight of her actions like never before. Her control had faltered, her methods no longer foolproof. Yet, instead of spiraling into despair, she doubled down on her resolve. She couldn't afford to lose her grip on the life she had created. She needed to find another man, another opportunity to regain the power she had lost. The hunger for control burned hotter than ever. Her next choice came quickly, a man named Joseph Baldwin, a wealthy landowner from a neighboring town. He was strong, commanding, and seemed to have everything Ruth had once wanted: a successful career, status, and the kind of respect she had always craved. Joseph was more than a man who needed a wife. He was a man who needed someone to challenge him, and Ruth knew exactly how to play her role. The letters she wrote to him were filled with promises of passion, devotion, and love. But unlike the others, Ruth's approach was different this time. She could feel her desperation creeping in. She needed to win him over completely, to make him feel that he was everything to her. There would be no room for doubt this time. There could be no mistakes. Joseph would never suspect what she truly wanted, and Ruth would make sure of it. When Joseph arrived in Montana, Ruth greeted him with warmth and grace, hiding the anxiety that swirled inside her. His presence was commanding, and for the first time, Ruth felt a flicker of uncertainty. Joseph was no ordinary man. He was accustomed to taking charge, accustomed to being the one in control. Ruth felt herself being drawn to him in ways she hadn't expected, and she realized that this time, the game might be different. For the first few days, everything seemed to go according to plan. Ruth played the part of the perfect wife, cooking his meals, tending to the house, making sure everything was in order. She gave him what he wanted, wrapped in the illusion of genuine affection. She had learned to do this by now. It was the perfect facade, a mask she wore so well. But Joseph wasn't like the others. He was distant at first, skeptical of Ruth's charms, but over time, he softened. He seemed to want her, yes, but not in the way that Ruth was used to. Joseph wanted respect, real respect, and Ruth realized something terrifying. She couldn't simply manipulate him with affection and sweetness. He wasn't as easily swayed as Frankly, Samuel, or even William. There was no way to buy his trust with false affection. She would need to do more. Ruth's world began to shift. She couldn't afford to lose Joseph. She needed him. If she could control him, she would finally prove that she was the one who held the power. But as the days passed, something else began to eat at Ruth, a feeling of inadequacy. The hunger for control was so consuming that it started to feel like a weakness, a desperate need that she couldn't escape. One evening, Ruth decided to take matters into her own hands. She prepared a special dinner for Joseph, knowing that he would be impressed by her attention to detail. She baked the pie with the same careful precision she had perfected over the years. This time, though, Ruth wasn't sure if she wanted to kill him. She was more determined than ever to win him over, to have him at her mercy. Joseph arrived home late that evening, tired from a long day of work. Ruth greeted him with a kiss, her fingers brushing against his collar. She was ready. As they ate, Ruth watched him closely. There was a tension in the air, an electric charge that neither of them acknowledged. Joseph seemed quieter than usual, as though he was weighing something heavy on his mind. Ruth tried to maintain her composure, but inside her pulse raced. Would he fall for her charm, or would he be the one to shatter her carefully constructed world? The pie was rich, delicious, and just a little too sweet. Ruth had made sure of that, but as Joseph took a bite, she noticed something that unsettled her. He didn't look at her with adoration like the others had. He simply ate, savoring the flavor, and then set the plate down. "I have something to tell you," Joseph said suddenly, his voice serious. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She had prepared for this moment. She knew what he was going to say, but the words he spoke were not what she expected. "I've been to see the doctor today," Joseph continued, his gaze meeting hers. "I know what you did to William." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. He knew, but how? Had he discovered the truth? How could he have possibly figured it out? "I didn't want to believe it," Joseph said, his voice cold now. "But I'm not a fool, Ruth. I've seen the way things play out with you." He paused, studying her. "I'm not here for whatever game you're playing. I came here because I thought I was meeting someone real, but you're nothing more than a predator." Ruth froze, her hands trembling slightly. She had been caught. The game was over. No, it wasn't. Ruth had one last card to play. She had learned long ago that in moments like these, desperation could be a powerful weapon. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You're wrong. I love you. I need you." Joseph stared at her, his expression unreadable. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have tried to kill me," he said simply, his words cutting deep. Ruth's mind raced. She couldn't lose him, not like this. She had lost so much already. The idea of losing him too was unbearable. Then, in a moment of madness, Ruth did what she had sworn she would never do. She tried to kill him again. She grabbed the bottle of poison, her hands shaking, and poured it into the last glass of wine. Joseph didn't notice as she handed it to him, his mind still focused on their conversation. But before he could take a sip, he stopped. His eyes widened as he looked down at the glass, then back up at her. "You think you can control everything, don't you?" Joseph said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "But in the end, you're the one who's trapped. You're the one who's dying inside." Ruth's eyes flickered with panic, but before she could react, the door swung open. A figure entered the room, James Monroe. "Enough, Ruth," James said firmly. It was too late. The night James Monroe entered Ruth's home, the air shifted. It wasn't just the arrival of a new person, it was the realization that Ruth's carefully constructed life was crumbling, piece by piece. James was not just any man, he was the one person Ruth could not control, and that frightened her more than she cared to admit. Ruth stood frozen for a moment, staring at the man who had just entered, his figure darkened by the doorway light. James had been Frankly's brother, a man who had been distant yet observant from the beginning. He was sharp, methodical, and ruthless when he needed to be. "I think it's time we talk, Ruth," James said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of certainty Ruth couldn't ignore. Her mind raced. She had done everything to keep her secrets hidden. She had manipulated men, poisoned husbands, and twisted love into something sinister. But now, her darkest fears had a name. James Monroe was no longer a distant relative. He was a threat. He had pieced together the truth, and now Ruth was faced with the consequences. Ruth's face remained blank, though her heart beat wildly in her chest. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice a little too high, too sharp. She forced a smile, but it felt hollow, empty. "I don't have anything to hide." James stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Don't play coy with me, Ruth. I've seen enough to know what you've been up to." He dropped a stack of letters on the table in front of her, letters she had sent to the men she had married, letters filled with the same promises of love, affection, and loyalty that had lured them all in. But now, those letters looked different. They looked like a trail of destruction. Ruth's stomach tightened. She knew what he was implying, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. She didn't want to face the truth, especially now when things were slipping out of her control. "You really think you can hide everything, don't you?" James continued. "I've spoken to people in town. I know the rumors. I know what you did to Frankly, to Samuel, and to William." He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air. "But what you don't realize, Ruth, is that you've already destroyed yourself." Ruth clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had spent years building an empire based on manipulation and lies, but it was all falling apart now. The foundation she had built her life on, love, control, power, was cracked, and there was nothing she could do to stop it from crumbling. She took a step back, her eyes flickering nervously between James and the letters. "You have no idea what you are talking about," she said, but the words felt empty, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "I loved them, every single one." James let out a dry laugh. "Loved them?" His voice was tinged with disbelief. "No, Ruth, you didn't love them. You controlled them." His voice hardened. "You poisoned them, used them, and discarded them when they stopped serving your needs." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. James was right, but admitting it felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed in, everything she had built her identity on. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. She wasn't the woman she wanted to be. "Why do you think they died, Ruth?" James asked, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "Because they loved you? No. They died because they trusted you. They trusted you to give them the love you promised, but instead, you took their lives, one piece at a time." The words hit Ruth like a slap across the face. She turned away, unable to look him in the eye. Was that all she was? A woman who took and took, never giving anything in return? It was the truth, and it felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Ruth's mind was spinning, but she quickly pushed those thoughts aside. She had been in control for too long to let it slip now. She couldn't lose now, not after everything she had done. "You don't understand," she said through gritted teeth. "I had to do it. I had to have them, to make them love me. I didn't know how to live without it, without someone wanting me, needing me." She felt her voice crack. "I was desperate." James stood there, silent for a moment, watching her. Then his voice softened. "We all have our demons, Ruth, but at some point you have to face them." Ruth didn't answer. The walls around her were closing in, the truth threatening to crush her. But she wasn't ready to surrender. She wasn't ready to give up on everything she had built. Suddenly, she grabbed the wine glass on the table, and without thinking, she poured the contents into James' glass. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't care. "If you think you know me so well, then why don't you drink to our future together?" She forced a smile, but it was brittle. James didn't even flinch. He looked at her with those cold, calculating eyes, the very same eyes that had seen through her every move. He didn't reach for the glass. He didn't even blink. "You think I'm like the others?" Ruth said, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. "You think you can control me too?" "You're wrong, James. I've been controlling everything for years. No one can break me." James shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. "No, Ruth, you're the one who's broken. You've been broken for a long time, and you just don't want to admit it." The words hit harder than any blow, and for the first time in years, Ruth felt herself falter. She had spent so long pretending, so long building her empire of lies, that she had forgotten what it was like to truly be loved. In a sudden fit of rage, Ruth grabbed the wine glass and threw it against the wall. The shattering glass echoed through the room like the breaking of her own life, and for a moment, everything felt like it was collapsing. And then, the silence. James stepped back, unbothered by the outburst. "You can keep trying to control people, Ruth, but in the end, it's not control you need. It's redemption." Ruth stared at him, a tear slipping down her cheek, though she quickly wiped it away. Redemption. She had never thought of that before. She had never thought she needed to be saved, until now. But there was no going back. Ruth had crossed too many lines to ever come back from them. The life she had built was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. James had exposed Ruth's darkest secrets, but this was only the beginning of the storm. Ruth would now face the consequences of her actions, but even worse, she would face the one thing she could never control, the truth. The aftermath of Ruth's encounter with James was suffocating. For the first time in years, she didn't feel in control. James had seen through her, exposed the hollow shell of what she had built, and that terrified her. She had always been the one pulling the strings, the one dictating the pace of everything in her life. But now, for the first time, she didn't know how to react. She wasn't sure whether she should try to push James away or face the consequences of everything she had done. In the days that followed, Ruth retreated into herself. She was no longer the confident woman who had manipulated Frankly, Samuel, and William. She was broken, fractured by the truth, and unable to escape it. But Ruth couldn't stay in that place for long. She needed control. She needed to feel the power she had once had. She couldn't let James win, and so she resolved to fix the mess she had made. She would find a way to make everything go back to the way it had been, to the way she had planned it. In the small town of Helena, Ruth had built a reputation as a perfect wife, a devoted lover. But behind closed doors, things had always been different. She didn't want love. She wanted control. She needed to possess, to dominate, and in the past, that had worked. But now, she had a new challenge: James Monroe. Ruth began to strategize. If she couldn't control James through her usual methods, then she would have to use something else. She knew he had weaknesses. Everyone did. And Ruth was no stranger to exploiting those weaknesses. But this time, things wouldn't go as smoothly. James continued to visit her regularly. His presence was a constant reminder that she was no longer in charge. Each conversation with him chipped away at the walls she had so carefully built around herself. One evening, after another tense exchange with James, Ruth decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew that if she could get James to trust her, truly trust her, then she could manipulate him just like the others. She had to break him down, make him see that he needed her. Only then would she have control again. Ruth invited him over for dinner that evening. She had already planned her approach. She would be charming, affectionate, and perhaps just a little vulnerable. She would show him the side of her he had never seen, the side that had once been full of warmth and love. As James arrived, Ruth greeted him with her sweetest smile, the one she knew always worked. "I'm glad you came," she said softly, leading him into the dining room where the table was set for two. "I thought we could talk. Really talk. No more games." James looked at her with suspicion but said nothing. He had seen too much of Ruth's manipulative side to trust her now. Still, he sat down at the table, his eyes never leaving hers. Ruth served him the meal she had prepared, and as they ate, she began to weave her plan. She spoke of how she had been wrong in the past, how she had let her need for control get the best of her. She spoke of her loneliness, her past, and the pain that had led her down this path. Her words were carefully crafted, each one designed to pull at his heartstrings. For a brief moment, James seemed to soften. He listened carefully, as though for the first time, seeing Ruth as a human being and not just the woman who had poisoned the men she had married. But Ruth wasn't finished yet. She had one final move to make. She reached for the wine bottle, pouring him another glass, her hands steady despite the turmoil inside her. The wine was rich, deep red, and she made sure it was exactly the way James liked it. The moment he took a sip, Ruth felt a slight surge of triumph. "Do you believe me?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Can you forgive?" "Dee?" James hesitated, his eyes searching hers, and then, as if he had seen through her mask, he finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Ruth," he said, his voice cold. "But I do know this: you've been lying to yourself for years. You say you want love, but you've never truly understood what love is." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She had thought she could control him, just like she had with the others. But this time, James wasn't falling for her act. His words hit her like a slap. She had always been so sure that love was something she could manipulate, something that could be twisted to her will. But James had just shattered that illusion. She felt a rush of panic. Had she lost him? Had she lost everything? Before she could respond, she saw something in his eyes, something that made her stomach twist. James wasn't angry. He was sad. "I don't think you are capable of love, Ruth," he continued, his voice low and steady. "Not the way it should be. You've spent your life manipulating others, trying to control them, and now you're trying to do the same with me. But it won't work. Not anymore." Ruth felt the walls closing in on her. She had lost control of James, and now she was starting to lose control of herself. The very thing she had sought for so long, the power she had craved, was slipping through her fingers. Her hands trembled as she looked at him, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do now? She had never been vulnerable like this before, never had someone see through her so completely. "I am not the person you think I am," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want it to be like this." James stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Maybe not. But this is who you are now, Ruth." He turned to leave, his back to her. "And you have to face that." Ruth watched as he walked out of the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. In that moment, everything she had worked for, everything she had built, crumbled. She had tried to control everyone, to twist love into a tool that she could use. But love couldn't be controlled. It wasn't something you could possess no matter how desperately you tried. And now, Ruth was left alone, truly alone, with no one to manipulate, no one to control. The truth of it hit her like a cold wind. She had lost everything, and she had no one left to blame but herself. But Ruth's story wasn't over. The final consequences were still to come. And what she would face next was more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. The silence after James left Ruth's house was deafening. The echoes of his words, the truth he had laid bare, circled around her like vultures. She had always prided herself on being the one in control, the one who could manipulate anyone, make them bend to her will. But James had seen through her. For the first time in years, Ruth didn't know who she was anymore. She stood by the window for what felt like hours, staring into the empty night. Her thoughts were clouded with doubt, shame, and a growing sense of loss. Had she really been this broken all along? The realization cut deeper than any betrayal. Ruth had built her entire life around control, love twisted into a tool of manipulation. And now, with the walls she had carefully constructed crumbling down around her, she felt exposed. She had no one left. The idea that love could be real, could be pure, still lingered in her mind. But every time she thought about it, she saw the faces of the men she had poisoned. The very thought of love filled her with disgust, because to her, love had only ever been a weapon, a way to win, a way to take what wasn't hers. Ruth turned away from the window, her hands shaking. What was she supposed to do now? She hadn't planned for this. She had expected James to be like the others, to fall under her spell, to let her control him the way she had controlled everyone else. But James wasn't just another man to manipulate. He had called her bluff, exposed her like no one else had. And in that moment, Ruth realized something. She had never really loved anyone. She had never allowed herself to. Ruth took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She couldn't let herself crumble. She was still Ruth Harper after all. She had always found a way to get what she wanted. She would fix this. She would regain control. The next day, Ruth put on her best smile, the one she knew could melt even the hardest of hearts. She had to keep moving, keep pretending, keep the game going. But even as she stepped out into the bright Montana sun, the weight of everything she had done pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her next target was already in her sights: Peter Harris, a young man who had recently arrived in town looking for work. He was handsome, naive, and eager to please exactly the kind of man Ruth could manipulate. But as she watched him from a distance, a strange feeling washed over her. Peter was different from the others. He didn't look at her with the same desperation, the same hunger for love. He seemed to see Ruth as she was, not as a perfect wife or an idealized lover. There was no excitement in his gaze, no need to win her over. It unnerved her, but it also intrigued her. She didn't want to admit it, but she realized something she hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. It was a feeling she could not bear. Later that evening, Ruth invited Peter over, determined to win him over. She cooked him dinner just as she had done with the others. The meal was perfect, the wine rich, the atmosphere warm, but the more she tried to charm him, the more she saw that Peter wasn't interested in what she had to offer. He listened to her stories, smiled politely, but there was no fire in his eyes, no excitement. Ruth's frustration began to mount. Why wasn't he falling for her? Why wasn't he desperate to please her like the others? She kept trying, complimenting him, showing him affection, but it was as if he saw right through it. Then, in a moment of clarity, Peter said something that shattered Ruth's illusion. "You know, Ruth," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you don't need to do all this." He looked at her kindly, almost pityingly. "You don't need to pretend." Ruth froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter looked her in the eye. "You've been doing this for so long, haven't you? Acting like you're someone you're not. But I can see it in your eyes. You don't need to manipulate people to get them to like you. You just need to be yourself." Ruth felt something in her snap. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rage. It was despair. Peter wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't captivated by her beauty or her charm. He wasn't interested in playing her game. He simply saw her as she was a woman who had spent her life pretending to be something she wasn't. Tears welled up in Ruth's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She stood up abruptly, her hand shaking. "I don't need your pity," she spat, her voice cracking. She turned away, her chest tight with the weight of everything she had lost. Peter stood, his expression softening. "I'm not pitying you, Ruth. I'm just telling you the truth. You don't have to keep playing this game. You're worth more than that." But Ruth didn't want to hear it. She could hear it. The truth was too painful, too real. For the first time, she realized that her entire existence had been a lie. She had never truly lived. As Peter left, Ruth stood alone in her empty house. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. For the first time, she didn't feel powerful. She felt small, insignificant. She thought about everything she had done, the lies, the manipulation, the poison. She had used love as a weapon for so long, but it had never brought her what she truly wanted. It had never filled the emptiness inside her. And now, she was left with nothing. Ruth sank to the floor, her back against the cold, hard wall. She had spent her whole life running from the truth, but now it had caught up with her. She was alone not just in the house, but in the world. And there was no escaping it. Ruth's journey was far from over, but the path ahead was darker than anything she had ever imagined. Now she would have to face the one thing she had been running from her entire life, the truth about herself. Ruth hadn't slept in days. The truth had finally caught up with her. She could no longer hide behind her manipulations, no longer control the narrative. Every attempt she made to move forward felt hollow, like she was walking through a life that wasn't her own. And now, as she sat at her desk, writing the final letter, she knew there was no turning back. The room was quiet except for the scratching of her pen on paper. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end, not just for the letter, but for everything. The empire she had spent so long building was collapsing, and she had no one left to blame but herself. In the letter, Ruth tried to pour out the truth, to explain herself, to make sense of the madness that had consumed her for so long. But the words didn't come easily. How could she explain the darkness inside her, the need to control, to manipulate, to destroy? How could she make anyone understand that, in her mind, she had never been truly loved, and that was why she had done all of this? The letter was addressed to James Monroe. He had been the one to crack her wide open, the one who had exposed her, seen through the layers of lies. It was James who had shown her what she had become, who had forced her to confront the reality of her actions. Ruth's hand shook as she wrote the final words. "James, you were right. I've spent my life trying to control everything, but in the end, I only destroyed what I had left of myself. I am broken, and there is no going back from that. I am sorry for the pain I caused you, for the lies I told. But you were the one person who made me see who I truly am, and for that I am grateful. Even if it's too late for redemption, at least now I know the truth about myself. Ruth." She put down the pen and stared at the paper. Was this enough? Was this the end she had wanted all along? Or was it just another attempt at control, another way to shape her narrative, even in her final moments? Ruth took a deep breath and stood up. The weight of the letter in her hand felt heavier than it should. She had written the truth, but the truth hadn't set her free. It had trapped her. Outside, the sky had darkened, the wind picking up. Ruth's mind raced as she walked to the window. She had always feared the quiet moments, the times when she couldn't hide from herself. And now, with nothing left to manipulate, she felt small. She felt vulnerable. Suddenly, the sound of a knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Who could it be? She hadn't expected anyone, and she certainly hadn't invited anyone over. Ruth felt a tightness in her chest. She quickly folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. The knock came again, louder this time. Ruth hesitated before walking to the door. What if it was someone who had finally figured her out? What if it was someone coming to take away the last shred of control she had left? She opened the door, and standing there was someone she had not expected. Peter Harris. His face was somber, and he looked at her with a mixture of concern and uncertainty. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She had pushed him away, dismissed him as just another man to control. But now, standing in front of him, she realized how much she had misjudged him. I found this at the post office," Peter said, holding up the letter she had written to James. "I didn't know it was for him, but I thought, you should know, Ruth. I'm here for you." Ruth stared at the letter in his hand, and for a moment she felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. Peter wasn't running from her, wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't like the others. For the first time, Ruth saw the look of genuine compassion in his eyes, a stark contrast to the cold manipulation she had grown accustomed to. She had spent so long hiding from love that when it finally came, she couldn't recognize it. "I don't deserve this," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve your kindness, Peter. I've done things, terrible things." Peter stepped forward, gently placing the letter in her hand. "You don't have to carry all of this alone, Ruth. We all make mistakes, but it's never too late to change." Ruth felt a wave of emotion rise up in her chest. She had never known this kind of acceptance, not from anyone, not even from herself. It was too much, too real. The tears came, spilling over before she could stop them. She had spent years manipulating everyone around her, and now, in this moment, she was finally being seen for who she truly was, flaws and all. "I'm sorry," Ruth sobbed, clutching the letter in her hands. "I never knew how to love. I thought if I could control people, they would love me, but it was all just a lie." Peter didn't say anything. He just stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering her the comfort she had long denied herself. In that moment, Ruth realized that love wasn't something she could control. It wasn't something that could be manufactured or manipulated. It was something that had to be given, freely. For the first time, Ruth let go of the need to control, the need to possess, and for the first time, she felt the weight of everything she had done begin to lift, even if just a little. "I don't know what the future holds," Ruth whispered, her voice raw. "But I know I can't keep running from myself." Peter nodded, his hand still on her shoulder. "You don't have to. I'm here." And for the first time in Ruth's life, she realized that maybe, just maybe, love could be real. It didn't have to come with strings attached. It didn't have to be earned through manipulation and control. It could simply be given freely and without expectation. Ruth looked up at Peter, a tear-streaked face showing the first signs of true vulnerability. She wasn't in control anymore, but that wasn't a bad thing. Ruth's journey was far from over, but the path ahead was no longer about control. It was about redemption and learning to live with the truth. Ruth's life had never been simple, but the past few weeks had turned everything she knew upside down. She'd once controlled every aspect of her life, manipulating the men she married, poisoning them when they stopped serving her needs. But now, with Peter's kindness and Jameis' relentless exposure of her true self, Ruth was left in a place she had never imagined vulnerable. Ruth sat at her desk, staring at the pile of letters in front of her. Her final act of manipulation had backfired, and now she was caught between what she had been and what she was becoming. The weight of her past choices pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She had destroyed everything she had built, and now there was no escape. But something inside her had shifted after her moment with Peter. After his words of kindness, his quiet understanding, Ruth felt the first glimmer of hope she'd ever experienced. Maybe she wasn't beyond saving. Maybe she could change. Still, deep down, Ruth was terrified. She didn't know how to live without control. For years, she had made love her weapon, used it to get what she wanted, never understanding that love, in its purest form, could never be manipulated. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Ruth tensed. Who could it be now? She wasn't expecting anyone, especially after everything that had happened. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and opened the door. Standing in the doorway was James Monroe. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She had expected him to stay away, to leave her to face the consequences of her actions. But here he was, standing on her doorstep once again, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I thought you might need to hear this," James said, his voice firm yet calm. "And I couldn't stay away, not after everything you've been through." Ruth swallowed hard, unsure of what he meant. Was this some kind of trick? Had James come to gloat, to remind her of her failures? Her mind raced with possibilities, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. James stepped inside, his gaze unwavering. "I've been thinking a lot about you, Ruth," he said, his voice softening, "and about what you've been through." Ruth took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Was he going to say what she feared he would? The truth was undeniable. She had been a monster. She had manipulated, poisoned, and destroyed everything in her wake. She had ruined her own life. But James didn't speak of her past. Instead, he said something that shocked Ruth to her core. "I've been working with the local authorities," he began slowly, "and I've uncovered something about the deaths of Franklin, Samuel, and William. It wasn't just about you, Ruth. There were others involved." Ruth froze. Others involved? She had been so focused on her own destruction that she hadn't considered that there might be more to the story. James continued, his voice steady. "You weren't acting alone. There were people in town who knew what was happening, and they helped cover it up. They were complicit in what you did, Ruth, and they're not going to get away with it." Ruth's mind reeled. The authorities? People in town helping her? How could this be? She hadn't realized just how deep the web of deceit had run. Her own guilt was overwhelming, but now she was faced with something much darker. There were people who had enabled her actions, who had been part of the lies. "I can't take the weight of this alone," James said, his voice low. "But I can't let you think you're the only one responsible. This goes beyond you, Ruth, and if we don't expose them now, they'll just keep hiding, and it will never stop." Ruth felt the ground beneath her feet shift. This wasn't just about her anymore. The people who had helped her, who had turned a blind eye to her manipulations, were now part of the darkness that surrounded her life. She wasn't just the monster in the story. She was a pawn, just like the men she had used and destroyed. Tears welled up in Ruth's eyes as the weight of it all crashed down on her. She had thought she was the only one at fault, but now she realized she had been part of a much larger, more insidious web. Her manipulations, her poisons, they had been part of something far darker than she had ever known. "Why are you telling me this?" Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. "Why now?" James stepped closer, his expression softening. "Because I believe there's still a chance for you, but you have to help me expose the truth. It's the only way to make things right. You can't hide anymore, Ruth. The world needs to know what happened. All of it." Ruth stared at James, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent so long hiding, lying, and manipulating that she had lost sight of everything that mattered. Now, for the first time, she saw a way out, a way to expose the truth, and finally be free from the chains she had bound herself with. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It'll help. You'll do whatever it takes." "I don't want to hide anymore." James nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. "Then it's time to face the consequences. It's time for you to find redemption, and it starts now." Ruth had taken the first step toward redemption, but the final confrontation was just beginning. The truth would come to light, and there would be no more hiding. Ruth stepped into the dimly lit room, feeling the weight of her actions pressing down on her. This was it, the moment of reckoning. The authorities had been notified, and with James' help, her web of deceit was unraveling. She had spent her life hiding behind manipulation and control, but now the truth was out. She had agreed to cooperate, but the hardest part was yet to come, facing the consequences of her own choices. The room was cold, the officer's eyes sharp and expectant. The lead detective, his graying hair and cold stare piercing, spoke first. "Ruth Harper, we know what you've done, but we need to understand why." Ruth swallowed. The question was simple, but the answer felt impossible. Why had she done it all? She had spent her life searching for love, but not the kind that nurtures and heals, the kind she could control. I thought if I could control love, I could finally feel it," Ruth said, voice shaking. "I thought if I could make them love me, truly love me, I would be enough." The detective's gaze softened. "And you thought the only way to make that happen was through manipulation, even taking their lives when they stopped loving you?" Ruth nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes. I didn't know how to love any other way. I didn't know how to let someone love me without controlling them." There was a heavy silence. Ruth's confession hung in the air, but she realized it was already too late. Her past could never be erased. The detective exchanged glances with his partner. "You've taken responsibility, and while that doesn't absolve you, well, take your cooperation into account." Just as Ruth was processing the weight of her words, the door opened. Peter Harris walked in. Her heart stopped. Why was he here? She hadn't expected him. "I'm here to support you," Peter said, his voice steady. "I know what you've done, but I also know you're not beyond saving." Ruth stared at him, disbelief flooding her. Could this really be happening? After everything she had done, could someone still care for her? Peter stepped forward, offering something she hadn't thought possible: real love. "You don't have to go through this alone. If you're willing to face what you've done, we can find a way forward together." Ruth's heart raced. She had always controlled love, used it to manipulate and destroy. But here, Peter was offering her something different. For the first time, Ruth felt the possibility of redemption, not just through the authorities, but through the love she had denied herself for so long. Peter wasn't just offering forgiveness, he was offering her a chance to be free. With a deep breath, Ruth realized something she had never allowed herself to believe before. She wasn't defined by her past. "I'm ready," she whispered, the first steps toward freedom beginning to take shape. Ruth's journey of redemption had just begun. But with Peter by her side, she wasn't alone anymore. The road ahead would be difficult, but the possibility of love was within reach. Final payoff: Ruth had spent her entire life running from love, manipulating it, twisting it to serve her needs. She had poisoned everything she touched, convinced that control was the only way to find peace. But in the end, the truth shattered her, and for the first time, she faced herself without the masks, without the lies. With Peter's unexpected support, Ruth finally understood that love wasn't something to control. It was something to be given and received freely. As she walked the path of redemption, Ruth knew the road ahead would be long, and the scars of her past would never fully fade. But for the first time in years, Ruth was willing to try. She was ready to accept the love she had once feared, ready to face the consequences of her actions, and begin the slow, painful process of healing. It was a new beginning, not just for Ruth, but for the woman she had always been meant to be.